Welcome to our next lecture in a series of maternity lectures from home. Today's lecture is about vaccination. We've already been through innate immunity, we've been through specific immunity. Now we're going to talk about vaccination and how that's involved in the immune system. Alright, the first thing that I'd like to point out to you guys is that immunity isn't just one thing. Immunity can be natural or it can be artificial. What we've talked about so far in class is natural immunity. These are immunities that are acquired through life experience. In other words, if you've been exposed to a virus, any other life experience, for example, when you were a child, any immunities that were passed on from your mother, those are natural. An example of natural immunity would be an active type, which is actively acquired through recovering from an infection. For example, if you had, say, the mumps and you survived that, then you would have lifelong immunity to the mumps. An example of passive natural immunity would be immunity passed on from mother to child. So in breast milk, for example, there are antibodies passed on from the mother to the child, which provides limited protection to the child from certain diseases. I hear examples here. Active is recovering from an infection. Passive would be passed on from mother to child. What we're going to talk about today is artificial immunity. These are things that are achieved through medical procedures. An example of passive artificial immunity would be treatment with collected antibodies against a pathogen. So for example, if you had a disease, if you had a virus, for example, and there was no way to treat it with antivirals or anything like that, there's no vaccination against it, you could potentially be treated with somebody else's antibodies that are already produced. Those antibodies can then help protect you against the virus. We see that going on right now with the Ebola situation. Some of the newer people that have developed Ebola, they've received transplants from one of the Ebola survivors that's here in the United States. Now those transplants are blood transfusions that contain antibodies against the virus. An active form of artificial immunity is vaccination against a specific pathogen. So the reason why this is active is because we're actively trying to prevent the infection. It's also active because it's triggering your own immune system to do the work. Treatment with collected antibodies is passive because your immune system isn't doing the work. It's somebody else's antibodies that are doing it. But in vaccination, the point is to get your immune system to fight off the infection. So active would be your vaccination strategies to stimulate your own immune system. Passive, however, would be a transfusion, for example, with somebody else's antibodies. Let's talk specifically then about vaccination, since that's the whole point of this lecture. Vaccination is defined as exposing a person to material that is antigenic, but not pathogenic. This is really, really key. This material causes an immune response, that's what antigenic means, but does not cause the disease that we're trying to protect the person against. It's not pathogenic. Discovery of vaccination was one of the farthest reaching and most important developments in medical science. There are so many vaccines out there that protect us from diseases that before used to ravage the human race, used to cause major mortality. But now we're protected against them because of vaccination. In general, vaccination works by stimulating a primary immune response. Again, that primary immune response, that is the first instance where antibodies are produced. So that's the initial exposure to a pathogen. So you are exposed to a pathogen, or at least parts of the pathogen, that causes your immune system to start producing antibodies. Then later on, if the actual pathogen enters your body, you already have antibodies able to be produced to that pathogen. So the secondary immune response that comes along will be immediate, powerful, and sustained. Now, when selecting a vaccine, so when putting together a vaccine, all the components that go into it, some of the things that we have to consider is the antigen selection. We talked last time about antigens and what makes a good antigen. Again, these are things that are specific to the microbes that we're trying to protect against. So parts of the outside of a bacterium or parts of the outside of a virus. They have to be things, again, that will elicit a good immune response, a strong immune response, and are not similar to any parts of yourself. Other things to consider with vaccines is the effectiveness, because if the vaccine doesn't work in protecting you, then there's no point in taking it. Ease of administration. Okay, we don't want a vaccine where you're going to have to be transfused with a lot of fluid, for example. Want something that's a simple shot, or even better, just a little squirt up the nose. Safety, of course, I think that's probably the biggest one. We don't want to give people something that is going to cause more harm than good. And then finally, cost. These are the checklists that somebody who's developing a vaccine, these are the kinds of things that they're going to go through as they are developing that vaccine, making sure that it meets all of these checks. So again, low level of adverse side effects. It needs to protect against all kinds of forms of the pathogen, or as many as you could possibly come up with. It should simulate an antibody response and also the cell-mediated response, because those T cells, like the cytotoxic T cells, for example, they're the ones that are going to go along and actively kill the microbe. Should have long-term effects, shouldn't require too many boosters, and it should be relatively inexpensive and easy to administer. When selecting an antigen, again, I'm going to go through some of the different key things that make a good vaccine. When selecting an antigen to use in a vaccine, we think back to what makes a good antigen. Well, a whole bacteria or a whole virus is going to make a very good antigen because it is unique to that pathogen. So some vaccines use live attenuated cells or viruses. Now what that means is that these organisms, whether they're microbes or viruses, again, viruses are alive, they're active, these are capable of being alive or capable of being active, but they're attenuated, which means that they are not capable of causing disease. Okay, so they are active but not able to cause disease. Slightly, somewhat, in some senses, safer and more palatable to the general public are whole cell or virus preparations made of killed cells or inactivated viruses. So now you don't have to worry about the fact that the cells are alive, you don't have to worry about the fact that the virus is activated. They are inactive, dead, they are definitely not going to cause disease, but they should also be able to elicit an immune response. The types of vaccines that we're starting to see more and more of now today are part of organism preparations. Those would be taking specific molecules from a bacterium or a virus that is antigenic, that we know causes an immune response, and just putting that into the vaccine. Then you don't run any risk of having any cells or anything like that in the vaccine. So these are some examples of whole cell vaccines. This is killed versus live attenuated. This tells you some of the advantages to each of the types of vaccines, and also some of the disadvantages. Okay? So if you look at it, some of the advantages to having live or active preparations versus killed are that viable organisms can multiply and produce infection but not disease. So that means that those vaccines confer a long-lasting protection. They can also usually require fewer doses and boosters because they are so antigenic, and they're particularly effective at inducing cell-mediated immunity. So particularly effective at stimulating those T cells. One of the disadvantages of using live microbes or viruses is that they require special storage facilities. They have to be kept cold, and they could potentially be transmitted to other people and could conceivably mutate back to the non-attenuated form, back to the virulent form that can cause disease. Now again, conceivably, it does not happen very often. Again, with the transmission to other people, it's extremely, extremely rare. But those are possibilities. The subunit are part of organism vaccines include taking the spikes from the virus or proteins that are in the envelope of the virus. It could be parts of the cell wall of the bacteria or part of the flagellum of the bacteria. You could also potentially take toxins from the bacterium and change it slightly to elicit an immune response to that toxin. Traditional vaccine preparation has been unsuccessful for many, many deadly infectious diseases out there. For example, HIV. Ebola so far does not have a vaccine. Malaria. There are several others on that list that are deadly diseases but have no vaccine out there for them. But there is currently research being done to try and make vaccines for all of these diseases. One of the new types of vaccines that are being researched are called DNA vaccines. This is when microbial DNA is inserted into a plasmid and then inoculated into a recipient. Theoretically, the human cell could take up the plasmid and express that microbial DNA. So the idea here is that we're just introducing DNA that encodes an antigen from the microbe. When human cells take up that DNA, they start producing the antigen themselves. Because the foreign protein is then, this antigen is then inside of the human cells, inside of the human body, the immune system can recognize that antigen and mount a response to it, mount an immune response to it, activating B cells and T cells. So this is the general idea just in pictures. You take the pathogen, you find the DNA that encodes the antigen you're interested in, put that into a plasmid that can then be injected into a human. The DNA, the plasmid, enters the human cell, allows that DNA to be expressed by the human cell. Then when that protein, that antigen, is produced, okay, it can elicit an immune response, creating immunity against that microbe. Again, this is a new type of vaccine. It's still being studied, and it's still being studied for a lot of different diseases out there. Another thing that goes along with vaccines is not just what antigen do you use, but also how do you administer it. And that was one of the key things to picking a good vaccine, developing a good vaccine, is that it should be easy to administer. The traditional ways that we administer vaccines are subcutaneous, so just under the skin, intramuscular, in the muscle, or intradermal. Okay, But the newer types of vaccines that are out there can be taken orally or as a nasal spray. They're not out there for very many diseases at all. An example would be flu mist. Flu mist is the flu vaccine that is a spray up your nose. There is a version of polio vaccine that is oral as well. Some vaccines need added chemicals to them in order to make them more effective. So we call these adjuvants. Adjuvants are special binding substances that help to enhance the immunogenicity of that vaccine. Now what I mean by that is some antigens are good, but they don't elicit enough of immune response on their own to really be a good vaccine. But if you add a special chemical, a special compound along with that antigen, that enhances their ability to elicit an immune response. Typically the way that it does that is it helps to prolong antigen retention at the injection site. Okay, it does that by precipitating the antigen, so it takes it out of solution and then holds it there in the tissues and is released gradually. So that way it's in high concentration in the tissues, making it more likely that the immune system will notice it and react to it. Another thing that adjuvants can do is it can help to facilitate contact with the antigen presenting cells and lymphocytes. Okay, so that means it can help facilitate the joining or the bringing together with antigen presenting cells and lymphocytes. One of the most common adjuvants you're going to find in a vaccine is alum, which is just aluminum hydroxide salts. Relatively harmless. Vaccines do have some side effects, and again, one of the things that we want to try to do with vaccines is make them have as few side effects as possible. But some of the common ones that you can have would be a local reaction at the injection site. I had one of those with a flu shot about 5 years ago. It was just kind of a big red area, got kind of warm and everything, but it wasn't too big of a deal. Some people can end up with a fever, and there's also allergic reactions to parts of the vaccine components that can occur. For example, if you get the traditional flu shot, those are made using parts of eggs, and if you have an allergy to eggs, that can cause a reaction. There are some relatively rare side effects that go along with only certain vaccines, not all of them. An example would be back mutation to a virulent strain. That's just with the oral polio vaccine. Now, one that I told you about that is administered orally. That polio vaccine is a live attenuated virus vaccine, and it sometimes can mutate back to a virulent strain when it's able to cause disease. We do not use that polio vaccine in the United States. Only some countries use it, and it's because it was cheap and easy to administer. Another relatively rare side effect is Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a syndrome that's very little is really known about it or what causes it. But we have known Guillain-Barré syndrome to be linked to different diseases and also some vaccination. Guillain-Barré syndrome causes paralysis that's usually only temporary. One example of when Guillain-Barré syndrome was a side effect of a vaccination was the swine flu vaccination of 1976. And oddly enough, my grandmother actually developed Guillain-Barré syndrome from that vaccination. She recovered quite quickly and was perfectly fine afterwards. Other things that are very rare that can happen with vaccines is there's disease can be caused due to contamination with other viruses or other chemicals. These are rarely rare because of all of the safety controls that we have over vaccines nowadays. And again, major allergic reactions to eggs or tissue culture components are a possibility. Just a note about vaccine safety. Again, some people have attempted to link childhood vaccinations with all kinds of different diseases such as diabetes, autism, and asthma. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about this stuff, and it can be difficult for consumers to differentiate between what's good information and what's bad information. So you've probably noticed the media a lot lately. Scientists are out there trying to address all of these fears and provide reliable information. So there are some published reports out there about the link between childhood vaccinations and autism and other diseases. One example would be the MMR vaccine, that's the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. The Institute of Medicine published a report in 2011 that shows that childhood vaccination does not, especially with the MMR vaccine, does not cause autism. And there's all kinds of reports like that out there trying to determine the links between childhood vaccinations and different diseases. But for the most part, the vaccines that are present right now and that are on the market are deemed safe. One of the terrible consequences of all these concerns about vaccine safety are that with fewer and fewer people getting vaccinated, fewer parents having their children get vaccinated, we're starting to see a resurgence in childhood diseases that we used to think were eradicated. Examples would be measles, mumps, diphtheria, some polio, typhoid fever, and especially whooping cough. Even in the United States, we're seeing these diseases popping up because some parents have not gotten their children vaccinated. Now, there are perfectly good reasons for some children to not be vaccinated, such as severe allergies to vaccine components, having diseases that make them immune compromised, and so vaccines are not indicated. And there's also religious beliefs that prohibit vaccination. These few children that fit into those categories would normally be protected because of something called herd immunity. That's when the rest of the population is vaccinated and therefore is protected from these viruses. They surround the few individuals that are not vaccinated and protect them as well from getting the disease. But herd immunity starts to break down when more and more people in the population are not vaccinated against these diseases. So that's why we're starting to see some of these cases popping up in a lot higher frequency, because herd immunity is starting to break down. Vaccination, again, is most prominent in childhood because that's when we're the most susceptible to diseases. If you can be vaccinated as a child, generally that means that you're going to be protected for life. But there are some diseases that you need a booster against, some vaccines that you need to get a booster for, because the immunization immunity can wane over the years. So, for example, we need to get boosters for pertussis, that's whooping cough, every 10 years or so. Adults also need vaccinations against other diseases that are not necessarily childhood diseases, but are adult infections like pneumonia. These are things that adults are more prone to than children. And other things too, like for example shingles. Shingles is more considered a disease of older adults because it's a reoccurrence of the chickenpox vaccine, or not vaccine, excuse me, virus. Alright, the last few slides here are just the immunization schedule for children and for adults. This is showing you all the different vaccines that children get and at what age they're supposed to get these vaccinations. It includes vaccinations against hepatitis, okay, DTaP, that is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, Haemophilus influenza, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis A. As children get older, they start getting, they have even more vaccinations, like HPV, that's human papillomavirus, That one is recommended for teenagers to get. Polio vaccine and pneumococcal vaccine. And then these are the ones that are recommended as an adult. So a lot of these diseases you need boosters for. Most of the time we get those boosters before we go off to college. Again, we need to get a flu shot every year, and we need to get a tetanus and pertussis, diphtheria and pertussis booster every 10 years or so. Thank you very much.